recording now. Okay. No, I'm glad some of you don't mind the English corrections too much. Full disclosure, my undergraduate degree was in English, and I taught English for a couple of years in high school. Oh, and a couple of years in middle school. If you're thinking about teaching and you think you're going to teach middle school, I just say, God bless you. That's an amazing age. I don't even remember what I was thinking when I was 13 or 14. All right, stuff. I think I've graded everybody's at least first question that you've turned in, so I'm the world's slowest grader, I think, so I'll keep going on those. Your quiz was graded automatically. Here's the deal, and you're supposed to take the quiz once. The reason that a couple of you emailed and said, can I redo the quiz because it says I can have more than one try? No. The reason that I put more than one possibility or chance for you to take the quiz is just in case you get started and the internet goes out and one question gets done, something like that. It's really more for technical difficulty. I assume that you understand the reason you can't take the quiz twice because you've already seen all the questions once you've taken it. So quiz grade average was 33, which is good, which means most of you missed like a question and a half, that's pretty solid stuff. And you may or may not have noticed the survey. I trust that you have. So answer that about the first quiz to help me design the second quiz. It's mostly asking if you want more questions. Notice I didn't ask if you wanted fewer. And the truth is I know you don't want fewer, so I wouldn't ask that. Yeah, I did. A couple of you have emailed things that you want me to look at certain questions, and I will at some point. I will, but not probably today. So yeah, I want to finish grading some of the other stuff too, but yeah, I'll look at stuff. If you dispute stuff, I'll look at it. But sorry for yawning at you. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the progressive era today, and I put the notes in, but I put them in today, so apologies. I don't know, I thought they were already in there, so I went ahead and put all the other notes in there too, so I didn't do that again. And I'll go ahead and load the weekly questions into the assignments section. I haven't done all of those yet, but I'll make sure to do that by the end of the day for those of you that maybe are already working on those and want to turn them in. All right, I think that's all I have to say about stuff. Do you guys have any questions about just general stuff so far? And I think your next big due date is the 16th of October. So 3 weeks away, 3.5, 4, 3.5. Yeah. Okay. All right, let me see. I need to open the documents. So thought I had them open. Clearly not, so that I can share them. So we'll look at today's weekly question, which is 18, and then we'll look at the notes. We'll get started on our business. And okay. All right, and by the way, I know I haven't shared it yet. Although in a minute, if I haven't shared it, you can tell me. So, because that will happen, there's no doubt. You know, I had a soccer Zoom meeting and messed up some technology. It's like, yeah, sorry. Okay. So let's look at the weekly question. And this weekly question is really very specifically about the presidential campaign of 1912. So that's toward the end of the chapter, so we won't really talk about that so much today, I don't think. But New Nationalism is the platform that's presented by Teddy Roosevelt, who's running for president as a third party candidate, which doesn't happen very often, and he'll be more successful than the average third party candidate, as you might imagine, because it's after he's already been president a time and a half. Well, time and 3/4, really. He becomes president after William McKinley is assassinated. And New Freedom is the plan proposed by a relatively new politician on the national scene, a fellow named Woodrow Wilson, who's an interesting fellow as well, and we'll talk a substantial amount about him. And they both really want the U.S. government, some version of the U.S. government, either federal or state, to try to continue with progressive reforms. Their discussion between these two different platforms is, should that be a national thing to do, which you're probably guessing is new nationalism, and you would be correct, that's the Roosevelt plan, or should that be more on the state level, which is New Freedom, which is the Woodrow Wilson plan. And you're thinking, state level, states' rights, he must have been a Southerner. Kind of, sort of, not really. He had been the governor of New Jersey right before he was the presidential candidate for the Democrats in 1912. And that's south of a few states, but it's north of most, of course. However, he had grown up in Georgia, so he probably had a little bit of a Southern leaning to him. That's going to be my understatement of the day. Even though it doesn't really come out in his academic self, you'll see it quite a bit, I think, in his political self, my opinion, which you don't have to share. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and look at the notes. All right. And you probably already noticed that this is one of those units that has 4 chapters. So 4 chapters for this unit, 4 chapters for the next, and then 3 at the end. So we start easy, you know, a little more stuff in the middle, and then 3 chapters at the end. And I know people usually when they ask questions, they're about grades. There's no cumulative final. We really just have 3 tests. So, or excuse me, 4 units and 4 quizzes, no test. Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little while about the Progressive Era. We talked quite a bit about the Gilded Age, which was kind of that period of truly unregulated capitalism. If you're one of those nice libertarian folks, that's your era. There's really no rules about much stuff. And what we find out is most of us would like at least a few rules. Even if you are a strict libertarian, you at least want, you know, your safety taken care of, and you don't want to get killed at work. You know, if you can have a few protections, most people are okay with that. They truly are. The Progressive Era is where we start to fix what we thought were possibly excesses of the Gilded Age. So this is where you're going to see a lot of legislation. And some of the legislation you go like, no, that was pretty necessary. And well, I don't know that there'll be a whole lot of legislation you'll look at in this era and you'll go like, nah, we didn't really need that. But maybe, I don't know, we'll see. Okay, so one of the things that happens during this era is the completion of the population shift from rural to urban. So at this point, more than 50% of the population lives in cities by 1920. And you'd seen that tendency really working its way in the Gilded Age because people were moving to the cities for jobs. And now you've really seen that complete. That's going to change politics quite a bit as well. And it's really, of course, how we remain today, where there's probably 20, there are 20 urban areas that really could control a presidential election if we didn't have the Electoral College. And you'll notice too, there's a lot of discussion right now, for probably some obvious reasons, I don't know, about getting rid of the Electoral College, which is the group of folks that technically elect the president and typically go by the voice of the voters within the state, but states are weighted differently. So some states have more votes than others, depending on population. And typically electors give all of their votes to the winner, even if they won by, 1,000 votes. So it does skew the election away from the popular vote on occasion. I think that's happened 5 or 6 times out of 40. So it's a fairly significant percentage of the time. And the reason we have the Electoral College is it's in the Constitution. So I have some friends who really are not fans of the Electoral College, and they're also not historians. And they tell me all the time, like, we have to get rid of that before the next election. It's like, no, that's not how that works. So constitutional amendment to get rid of something like that, which we have gotten rid of an amendment. We'll talk about one of those that actually passes during the progressive era. We've reversed one amendment before, but you reverse it the same way that you got one. You propose to get rid of it. Takes 2/3 of the states to agree to the discussion, 3/4 of the states to approve the amendment, no matter what the amendment says. That's why we don't have very many amendments. We have 10 at once, and then we have 18 cents. And one of those was actually supposed to be part of the first 10, sort of the 11th, but now it's the 28th. All right, back to business. So we got everybody moving to the city. And we kind of briefly mentioned political machines in the last chapter. And these are organizations within cities that control city government. Part of the reason they were able to control city government is they offered what you might consider services to people who were poor. They also offered services to people who were wealthy too, like police protection and government contracts, probably in ways we wouldn't think were proper in the modern era, although probably still go on in certain ways. But the poorer people didn't always get police service, they didn't get help finding jobs, they didn't get help with childcare, that sort of thing. And sometimes these political machines made deals with employers, and if the employers got those new employees to vote for them, then they would get certain benefits like the job or possibly an affordable place to live, which is probably scary, but still affordable. So political machines provided things that people wanted or needed in some ways, but there were strings attached. Also during that time period, and we'll talk about social gospel and social Darwinism in this chapter as well, but also during this era, churches sometimes provided those things. And I don't know if you would consider there to be strings attached to churches giving help to people who were poor. The assumption sometimes from those people, the people who receive the services, was that you needed to attend the church. Sorry. It's like super dizzy right now. This is why I have my eyes closed. It's not that you guys look bad. It's just keep my eyes open. The whole room is spinning. So kind of a weird allergy issue that I have from time. Okay. All right. Looks to me like the next thing that I want to talk about is muckrakers. Oh, I'll just mention too that getting rid of political machines leads to a city manager form of government for most large cities. So you elect a mayor and city council, but they don't manage the day-to-day workings of the city. You hire professional staff who do that. And that's pretty much what every city in the country does now. And depending on where you live, sometimes the politicians, the people who were elected, have more control over the day-to-day workings of the city. So, and that tends to be true in smaller cities and also southern cities sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. But typically, the day-to-day workings are managed by professionals. You don't want your mayor fixing the water plant or something like that. Nobody wants that, unless your mayor's really good at stuff like that, but most aren't. All right. Muckrakers. The book's going to talk about different investigative journalists during this time period. And when they first kind of came on the scenes, people thought that they were really purveyors of fake news. So kind of the same way that we view whatever news channel presents information in the way we seem to disagree with. But the thought was during this time period that they were just stirring up trouble. Things were really going kind of well, that the economy was expanding, that businesses were creating wealth, this was all good for the country, and these guys were just causing trouble. So a muckraker stirs up nasty stuff. And muck is like gross stuff, and then of course raking it would stir it up. Occasionally maybe you rake leaves or something like that. I try really hard not to, but it just has to be done from time to time. All right, so muckraking investigative journalists. That nickname was given to them by Teddy Roosevelt, who at first also thought they were just causing trouble, but then over time starts to see them in a different way and really kind of partners with them in some pretty dramatic ways. Now, any of these books you could read for your book review if you wanted to. So your call on that. How the Other Half Lives is a Jacob Riis book, which he's a reporter and a photographer, and he goes to different neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods in New York City, and describes them and makes pictures of their apartments and gives like room size diagrams, things like that. But also makes comments about the different ethnic groups, which you may or may not have an appreciation for. And it does sort of reveal some of the acceptable prejudices of the time period by what he calls different groups. But those are usually slang names, inappropriate slang names they're ethnic slurs in our era. During that time period, they were considered appropriate slang names, and they typically were for different European groups. But that's an interesting book because it reveals a whole lot of stuff. That you can find online for free in lots of places. Shame of the Cities is the Lincoln Steffens book about getting rid of political machines, and it seems like that's very specific to Cleveland during that era. Lewis Hine, you see a lot of his photographs anytime anyone talks about child labor during that time period. And there's a big push, an unsuccessful one, but there's a big push in this era to end child labor. And then The Jungle is probably the most famous book of that genre. And your 11th is like, what grade is that? Your 11th grade history teacher. I know I did, so I know, a couple of you may have gotten to experience this in my class, but The Jungle is the meatpacking plant book. And Upton Sinclair, who's like a legitimate socialist, he's going to run on the Socialist Party ticket, and he'll eventually become governor of California. I know some of you are going like, of course it was California, because we just have that anti-California thing going here in Texas sometimes. Excuse me. But this book, Upton Sinclair was working as a journalist, and he wanted to write about conditions in meatpacking plants in Chicago. And in the book, it's called Packing Town. And so he writes this novel about a group of people, Jurgis and his family, who moved from who knows where in Central Europe. And they come to the United States, and Jurgis is like a linebacker-sized dude who's tough as nails, and no problems can ever harm him. And by the end of the book, his kid is dead, his wife is dead. I don't want to spoil it for you, sorry. He's injured, and he just kind of runs around the countryside telling people socialism's the answer, which was the goal. I mean, Upton Sinclair's goal was to convince people in the United States that socialism would be better for the United States than capitalism. And in this era, socialism is a new thing, relatively speaking, and hadn't been tried on a very large scale. We have, we have different evidence about this, and so people might come to different conclusions in this era and maybe think, well, how did he not know about Joseph Stalin? Well, because, that hadn't happened yet. But what he will point out is, and the thing that people remember, the conditions in the meat packing plants, what ends up in people's sausage, which is not pretty, and that's usually the chapter that teachers make their students read. There's also a chapter where somebody ends up as part of the lard, which is not a cool thing. And he says about his own book that he aimed for America's, he didn't say brain. What did he say? But he hit their stomachs. So he aimed for their heads, but hit their stomachs. He wanted them to think socialism was a good solution. Instead, they thought, we got to clean up meat packing plants because nobody wants to eat that foolishness in their sausage. And, all of us would agree that he did a good thing, whether it was the thing he intended or not. After Teddy Roosevelt, the president, read the book, that's when you see a big push for the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's pretty gross. So a lot of these writers in this era, Ida Tarbell writes about difficulties in steel mills, and she also writes about Rockefeller. But a lot of the writers during this time period reveal these sorts of difficulties, and then local, state, and national government take on some of these tasks to try to fix these things. Okay, so here are some big pushes during this time period: ending child labor and trying to get people to join labor unions. And you will see two major labor unions in this era: the AFL, which continues to grow and will really kind of reach its height in the 1950s and 60s, kind of post-World War II, although it has great success in the 1930s as well. And the Industrial Workers of the World, which is a legitimately communist workers union. So they want what communists want: the overthrow of private property, and it's to be held collectively. The socialism is where businesses are to be run by the state. This is a super simplified version of it, of course. Communism is where the businesses should be run collectively by the workers at that business. Excuse me for the scrolling there. So these guys want the workers, the proletariat, to rise up, take over the business, and run it. And in parts of our history, really before World War I, this is not an outlandish thing to talk about. And then in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, being communist or socialist is seen as more acceptable. After World War II, not so much. The AFL is fairly conservative, white, male, skilled workers still, better working conditions, better wages, and their membership triples during this time period. So they're very successful. And when we talk about something being a bread and butter issue, that's really kind of a throwback phrase to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I know it was used when I was a kid, but the assumption was you had bread and butter at every meal. Maybe why we were chunkier back then. Maybe we weren't, I don't know. It's a lot of carbs and fat, isn't it? But bread and butter issues are those day-to-day things that people expect. So just normal day-to-day stuff that seem regular, like, being safe at work and getting paid relatively well, or at least getting paid by the hour or having a minimum wage. The international workers of the world, they are communist, maybe socialist, but really more communist. And they want what they want: workers' revolution to overthrow the business and control the means of production. Socialist Party, also more active during this time period and successful. And they run a national candidate, Eugene Debs. He runs for president 5 times. Now, he gets arrested a lot, you'll notice that, but it's primarily for for his participation in strikes. He doesn't go around, destroying things or harming people necessarily, but he does lead strikes, which are usually are fought back against with injunctions during this time period. So the court rules that the strike's illegal, and if the strikers don't go home, then they get arrested. So that's how Eugene Debs got arrested a lot. Also, birth control is an issue during this time period. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, what sorts of birth control would they be using during this time period? The same sorts of birth control that have been used all throughout history, but the until the 1960s when a pill is developed. However, birth control is not so much about methods of birth control, but really more about information about birth control. Is it okay to talk publicly, give public lectures about birth control? Can you talk about it at school? That sort of thing. You definitely could not talk about it at school during this time period, and even talking about it in public in a lecture or a forum was considered, well, in some places it was considered pornographic. In other cases, it was just considered obscene. So you're violating a local obscenity law. And also, doctors and nurses were prohibited from talking about birth control and family planning with their patients. So there really was a huge prohibition about this. See what else I want to say. There's definitely more to say about Margaret Sanger. My goodness, that is a strange woman. Most people would agree that it's okay to speak about family planning. And really what they wanted to talk about was, how if you didn't want to have a child every year, there were ways to take care of that, and explaining people's ovulation cycles, that sort of thing. And Margaret Sanger was a public health nurse and became pretty passionate about this issue because of some of the women that she cared for who would give themselves abortions because they kept getting pregnant. And if you're wondering, was abortion legal? No, gosh, no. And yeah, no. And okay. So birth control during this era wasn't really about abortion. It's really about preventing pregnancy and family planning. However, the reason that when you hear about Margaret Sanger, you usually hear about Planned Parenthood and then you hear about abortion, is because her group, the American Birth Control League, is what becomes Planned Parenthood. So she's essentially the founder of Planned Parenthood, which is going to make her, a controversial person. Also, the way she lived her life will also make her a controversial person. So she's not really a woman of her time period in a lot of ways. She starts to hang out with the socialist folks in large cities, and New York City is where she lived. Emma Goldman is being probably one of the more famous ones. And sometimes people referred to those folks as parlor socialists because they were people who were kind of upper middle class, and they had socialist meetings in each other's parlors where they had wine and expensive food and talked about socialism and probably didn't do very much about socialism. Margaret Sanger went out and gave lectures about birth control and then got arrested, and she had kind of a hard time. So her First Amendment rights, in her way of viewing it, were being violated. But in that era, they saw the First Amendment differently. Also, when we get to the 1920s, she's going to write pretty extensively about different ethnic groups who should be sterilized so that they can't continue to reproduce and make our society less able. And almost everyone I've ever met is probably in some way a part of one of those groups. I know that I definitely am, and my husband definitely was. So, you'll look at her writing and you go like, what in the world was she thinking? And unfortunately for her, she wrote it down. So you can find it. Now, she'll change her mind later on, but yeah. But she's an interesting person, I think. and super controversial. Yeah, no, this is, yeah, she's rough. And in the 30s too, in the 40s and the 50s, you can read all kinds of crazy books that'll talk about how, especially in state-run asylums or hospitals or penitentiaries, they just sterilized people without their consent. It's like, yeah, we don't want any more criminals, or we don't want any more people with mental health issues, or we don't want, and sometimes they did this too in orphanages when the kids, the girls, got older. So, oh my goodness. All right. Okay. Immigration. We're starting to have people check in during this time period. Before this time period, you got here, you got to stay. You were tough enough to get here, you got to stay. I I have read in some instances that maybe they're doing, I don't, gosh, somebody's commenting that, that they're holding illegal immigrants and maybe doing things against them or to them that they're not asking, that they're not asking for. Maybe even, I had not read that they're doing sterilization, but oh my goodness, no, that's highly illegal, should never be done, that sort of thing. Yeah, because of this time period and later. Actually, we don't really start to think that's a terrible idea till the 1960s. It's really, yeah, the civil rights movement sort of stuff. Or, yeah, it takes us a long time to figure out that we're wrong. Yeah. So immigration, people are checking in during this time period. And if you check in and we decide there's something about you we don't want here, like maybe you're sick, or they would give IQ tests to people coming in, and if they didn't pass them, then we might not let you in, or we might hold you until you were well, that sort of thing. So people would get quarantined on the way in. The IQ tests were in English, so if English wasn't your first language, or maybe you spoke English but didn't read it, which is going to be super common during this era because most people don't go to school. I know, I'm sure my husband wouldn't have minded me telling you this. When he grew up, Spanish was his first language, and they did not really write or read Spanish in their household. They just spoke it. So later on, when he became a Spanish teacher, the hardest part for him was the writing because he hadn't done a lot of it. Now, Spanish follows pretty much all the rules and is beautiful in that way. So, he learned it pretty quickly. Plus, he was fluent in it, but he was fluent in spoken Spanish. And that's really kind of true of most people during that era. We're talking 1900. And even people who lived in the United States, if English was their only language, a lot of times they didn't read and write it very well because without formal education, and your purpose with language was to communicate. And if you could do all your communication verbally, you didn't need to write. Don't tell your English teacher I said that. You do need to write now. So, all right, so you check in for immigrants. European immigrants typically checked in at Ellis Island in New York City, and Asian immigrants typically checked in at Angel Island near San Francisco. And Mexican Americans, they probably didn't check in, to be honest. There were check-in points in El Paso or in the San Gabriel Valley in California, but the truth is that border's not going to be monitored very well during that time period. Some people would argue during this time period either. It's a big border. It is. And most of our history with Mexico, especially in the era where we took the northern half of the country, that border is really fluid and people just kind of come and go depending on, in the old days, it was probably more dependent on weather and that sort of thing. In the more modern era, like late 1800s, early 1900s, or through the 1900s, it was probably more dependent on the economy. If the economy is better in the United States, people are going to migrate to the United States for jobs. And then if it seems to slow down here and looks a little better in Mexico, people would go back to Mexico and stay. It was a very fluid border, and in a lot of ways still is. Women become a larger part of the workforce with biggest growth in the clerical sector, and that's partly because it becomes more mechanized. So you got typewriters and adding machines and things like that. Um, Sorry for the yawn again. The Women in Economics book, you could read that for your book review. I've never had anyone read that, to be honest with you. I've only read excerpts, but she mostly just argues that if you want to be independent as a woman, you don't want to be dependent on your husband, which was pretty much your path in life during this era. You got married and your husband worked and you stayed home and took care of the kids, or maybe did a little, like maybe baking or cleaning or something, made butter in the country, I don't know, sold eggs. You had a little side business, but your income was pretty small comparatively speaking. If you want to be independent, you have to pay your own bills. There's so much truth to that. In every aspect of your life, isn't it? Like if you're one of those 18, 19-year-old people, 20, early 20s, you're going, man, I got to get out of the house. You can't get out of the house till you can pay your own bills. And if you're one of the grown people who's paying your own bills, like, dang, this paying your own bills thing is not cool. But it does lead to independence. You get to make your own decisions, which are limited by how much money you have to pay your own bills sometimes. But there you go. All right. So more women are working outside the house, or at least until they're married. But the truth is, most are not having careers, although this is the era where you start to see a few women doctors and lawyers and things like that. We'll kind of switch back to being more conservative after that. And if you study U.S. history a lot in the 20th and 21st century, you'll notice that we do that. Sometimes we go like a little crazy and we're just super like, woohoo, anything goes. And then we usually kind of pull back and become a little more conservative. And then, and most of us kind of hang out in the middle somewhere where we're not super conservative or super liberal. The book talks a lot about Henry Ford, as it should, because Henry Ford's super important. And you could easily read a book about Henry Ford and you would be well suited to do that as well. If you like to read about manufacturing process, he's certainly an innovator in that way. He's also like, I know it's fun to find out about history people, isn't it? He's also super racist. Okay. And if you're wondering which ethnic group he dislikes, the Jews. That's going to come up in the 30s. Just trust me on this. There's some book I read one time called Henry Ford and the Jews. It's not cheery at all. But for us, for Ford in this era, we're fine with Ford mostly, kind of. He becomes synonymous with the idea of the moving assembly line, mass production. He doesn't invent it, he just expands it and really, in some ways, perfects it. And there are lots of good things about Henry Ford. I'm not trying to say he's all bad. It's just his one bad thing is pretty bad and at a really bad time in history. But at any rate, one of the things he does that most people like is he creates his own minimum wage when there's no law about it. So he says, we won't pay less than this. And one of the things we want is for our employees to be able to purchase our product. So he wants to make an affordable car. Yeah. And if you've seen the old Ford commercials where he talks about democratizing the automobile, he's quite serious about that. So his thought is, I can make plenty of money if I just sell a whole bunch of cars and I can have, mass volume, small profit. And that's what he does. So mass production, mass consumption is referred to as Fordism. And you see other industries really expand on this. And, Ford goes a little crazy about this maybe. And, he builds the River Rouge plant, which, is still pretty successful. I know up where my dad and brothers live in Ohio, there's a Ford truck plant that's still quite successful. And in this era, it's probably not the smartest thing Ford ever did, but they built a plant in the Amazon region in Brazil because, they're going to need cars too. That didn't work out quite as well. But the idea of expansion and then an international market eventually And in this instance, an international market would be more where you build a plant in another country rather than shipped the cars overseas, which is what we see in the modern era sometimes. Now they build different companies build plants all over the world. But promise of abundance, prosperity, American standard of living draws people in massive numbers to the United States during this era until the advent of what we'll later call World War I, what they would refer to as the Great War. Sometimes it does fall short of reality because even though the economy is expanding, the folks at the top seem to be benefiting more than the folks at the bottom. And that is almost always true in our history, almost always. There are a few times where the bottom and the middle expand more than the top, and you'll look at those times and go, wow, I wish I were in them. And you'll be amazed. This isn't one of them. Although we are going to start to create a middle class during this era. It kind of slows down a little and then completely stops during the Great Depression. And then we'll start again after World War II. And I think most people who look at economic numbers would say right now the middle class is probably a little more in decline, and that there's more growth on either side of the middle class. All right, general progressive thought. At work, the big writer, and you could read this book too, it's just called, I think it's just called Scientific Management in the Workplace. The truth is this would be an incredibly boring book to read, but it would give you some insight into what they thought the workplace should look like. And there's a big discussion of ergonomics in this book, the science of the motion of work. It's not really a physics book, so if you like physics, don't get excited and go like, I'm reading a physics book. It's a general discussion of that. But it's Frederick Winslow Taylor, and he talks about how if you're more efficient at work, then it's better for everyone. You get more things produced, things are safer, the workers may not have to work as many hours. Now, he is never ever talking about, is the employee going to be happier? Because that's not a goal of scientific management. The goal of scientific management is efficiency. Now, Taylor's not an advocate of socialism, but there are other people who are. So people will talk about how maybe the government should control certain industries. Those are typically utility type things, maybe still a discussion of railroad, telephone, and telegraph. The AFL reminder, American Federation of Labor, and then Industrial Workers of the World, you see progressive thought reflected through all of these things. Scientific management, less concerned about the worker, but more about the efficiency of the workplace. And then socialism, AFL, and the labor unions, of course, more concerned about workers' rights, worker safety, and they're going to push for the stuff you would expect them to push for, plus communism. So science supports safe, efficient, and unimaginative workplace where you're not making too many decisions. You're just doing the same thing over and over and over again until you can do it essentially in your sleep, but hopefully not officially in your sleep, because that's unsafe. Socialism, workers' rights, suggested industrial freedom and ownership of a job, which is a fascinating discussion during that time period, which Andrew Carnegie will write in favor of, but until people go on strike at his workplace, and then I go like, no, you don't own that job. So the thought was that people had a right to a job so that you really couldn't fire them without helping them to find a new job. Now, there's no workplace that followed that philosophy during this time period, but that philosophy was widely written about during that era. Supreme Court and the law land somewhere in the middle. What you'll see during this era is that the courts and the federal government will become more protective of workers' safety, but they certainly don't become, anything close to socialist during this time. The IWW will lead large effective strikes during this era, and the courts sometimes will say that striking is okay. Sometimes they will also say that it's okay for a state or an area like a county or a city to protect workers, sometimes they won't. The cases that are typically discussed regarding this are Miller versus Oregon, which is a 1908 case, and Lochner versus New York, which I think is a I think I've got this backwards. So I think maybe that's 1904. All I know is Lochner happens before Miller. I probably should have reversed these, so sorry. The Lochner case is about bakers, people who bake bread and whatever else you bake. In New York, as you might have guessed, Lochner's a bakery owner. And the state of New York has passed a law that says you have to restrict the number of hours bakers can work in a day or a week. And they did that because too many bakers were getting hurt at work. Because, you know, I guess after about the 12th hour of baking, you're starting to burn yourself accidentally. So the law was to protect bakers at work. The guys arguing for Lochner, the bakery owner, said that if you limit the number of hours a person can work, you've essentially violated the Fifth Amendment. You've punished them without due process of law. Maybe they want to work 18 hours a day because that's life, liberty, and potential property, and you've taken that, their right to due process away, you've punished them. And the courts go, yeah, that's kind of true. So in the Lochner case, which is earlier, 1900s, I really think it's around 1904, but I don't remember. But it's definitely earlier than Miller. The courts say, yeah, we can't restrict workers' ability to work as many hours as they want. Let's give them freedom to work 18 hours a day if they like. The Miller case, really kind of the same case, except it's in laundries, not bakeries. And laundries were mostly staffed by women. So the people who argued in Miller versus Oregon, the lawyer was Louis Brandeis, who'll be on the Supreme Court pretty quickly after this. Well, no, it's like 15 years after this. It's 1908. He's appointed during the Wilson administration. So it's really like 10 years after this case. But at any rate, Louis Brandeis, whose legal assistants who do all the research are women, argues that women in laundries should be limited, and the state of Oregon is okay in doing this. He argued for the state of Oregon. The state of Oregon is okay in doing this because if women are not at home, what's happening to the kids? Who's taking care of them? I mean, you guys know you can't let dads take care of kids because they do stupid stuff with them. We've got videos now, so we have more evidence. I know when I was a kid, our favorite thing was when dad went to the grocery store because we got much better, much more fun food and less healthy. But you can't leave the kids home with dad, or you can't leave the kids home alone. That's bad for society. A woman's place primarily is to take care of her family, and her job is secondary. So limiting the amount of hours that women work in a day is good for society. And the Supreme Court says, yeah, it kind of is, which is, you know, why you're seeing so much stuff written about Ruth Bader Ginsburg right now, because she's going to argue cases that essentially reverse the ideas behind Miller versus Oregon. Okay. All right. So sorry for insulting the dads. I really am just kidding. Except my dad would buy a whole lot more chocolate than my mom, which made us really. No, my dad is a fairly responsible person. I think you would agree. But the idea behind this really is that a woman's place is in the home. So when you look at, and taking care of a family, when you look at, I forgot to unplug the phone, didn't I? If you look at Lochner versus New York, and then you look at Miller versus Oregon on the surface, you'll go like, hey, the Supreme Court is protecting workers' rights and the right of a state to limit hours and regulate safety, that sort of stuff. That's not exactly what's happening. Yeah, something else is happening. Okay, what would an era that's progressive be without, oh my gosh. Sorry about the phone thing. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna go unplug the phone. You go do what you need to do. I'll take like a minute. It won't even take a minute. Just hang on. All right, sorry. Why do I still have a phone? Does anyone know? All right, what's a progressive era without amendments? We are going to pass some amendments, and one of these is my all-time favorite. Actually, two of these I like quite a bit. I'm, all right. No one likes the 16th Amendment, sorry. Creates an income tax. Did you know we did not have an income tax until the 19 teens? They just survived on import-export taxes, excise taxes, process taxes, that kind of stuff. So this creates a income tax. Now, typically only wealthy people paid it, and something like, I don't know, 10% of people in the United States paid income tax at all during this era. I think now it's about 50%, I think, where most people, I mean, I know everybody pays, but a lot of times people get it all back. Yeah. And I know too, oh gosh, if you're just starting this adventure into the workplace, you've noticed that not all the taxes they take out are income taxes, so you don't get all of those back. Maybe you will in services, who knows? But that's why they created the income tax, was to pay for services that they planned to expand during this era. Okay, and in some ways too, it's supposed to pay off some Spanish-American War debt. If you're wondering, that's paid off. That's not why we still have the income tax. This is a small, short war. We didn't really have that much debt. Okay, 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. And maybe you're thinking like, how did they elect them before? Either the governor picked them or the state legislature picked them. So the thought was, if people got to vote directly for their senator, and that's the person who serves the 6-year term, and we get 2 per state. So that is considered the upper house or upper chamber. They tend to have more power, like they get to confirm Supreme Court justices. We're just about to see something very interesting that the senators get to do. And the thought was, we'd rather vote for those people than have them appointed by other politicians that we gives us another chance to participate directly in our democracy, or I know, representative republic, but there's some democratic processes. So this added a democratic process to the mix. And the thought was it would increase the percentage of people who voted. That probably didn't happen, but it didn't. But from time to time, more people will vote depending on how dramatic the issues are. 18th Amendment, one of my all-time favorite amendments as a really long-time high school teacher, prohibition. Because, dang, kids, what are you thinking when you're drinking? You're not thinking. Okay. And also this works for me because, it's either Coke Zero or today it's water. I'm trying to drink more water. Alcohol, I don't care. However, this creates a big mess. So even though in principle, I think this is kind of a fun amendment, I know as a historian in practice, this didn't go all that well. So prohibition, it did go well in some ways, but not all that well. Prohibition says you can't make, sell, or distribute alcohol in the United States at all, for anybody, no matter what your age is. And if you're wondering, why didn't that go well? Well, because sometimes people like to drink. What it does is it makes alcohol illegal, and then people will do some interesting things to get alcohol. It leads to the rise of organized crime. So before this, crime had really been kind of disorganized. Now it becomes more of an enterprise so that they can produce, sell, and distribute alcohol. And billions of dollars are at stake here because this thing lasts a while. And people always say like, that was a terrible idea. No one was in favor of that. It became an amendment. Remember, 2/3 of the states have to agree to even discuss it. 3/4 have to approve it. So if it's an amendment, it is by its very nature, it is necessarily a popular idea. And we keep it for 13 years. It's often referred to as the Noble Experiment. If you're wondering why we did it, mostly because dudes, yes, today's a sexist class, dudes who lived in cities drank too much and they didn't take care of their families. And who's paying for that? Taxpayers. So if we made alcohol illegal, these drinking dudes wouldn't have anything to drink, and then they would spend their money on their families instead of alcohol. We're definitely blaming Catholics on this one and Catholic immigrants. So it's like those darn Catholic immigrants come to the United States, live in the big cities, because that's where the factories are. They drink too much, they don't take care of their families, and the rest of us have to pay for it. So
I think pointing at the Irish specifically.
well, this one, because the Irish were they were earlier, but these are more of those Central European immigrants. And we're, until World War I, we're kind of anti-Italian as well. So we'd really kind of dissed on the Irish before, but there's not a big wave of Irish immigration during this era. And what you'll notice too, with immigrant groups that we dislike strongly, like the Irish, once we draft them and have them fight in a war, we go like, nah, they're great. And so we drafted lots of Irish folks for the Civil War in the North. So after the Civil War, it's like, nah, the Irish are cool. So in this instance, it's probably more the Italians and the Central Europeans. And the thought is Catholics are even drinking at church. They don't use the grape juice, they're using wine. So you know those people just drink too much. So this is really, in a lot of ways, kind of an anti-Catholic Central European sort of thing. Yeah. All right, there we go. So there's a Catholic going, yeah, we drink at church. Okay. You don't drink much at church, and right now I bet you're not drinking at church. So the one way that prohibition was successful is poor or working class guys, poor men in the city really couldn't afford alcohol after this. So it really does decrease the amount of drinking in the poor urban guy category. Doesn't work for anybody else, but it works for the poor urban guy category. But it does create a huge mess of stuff. It does. So, I don't know. We'll get rid of that later, but much later. I think it passes in 1919 and then, or 20, I don't know, it takes effect in 1920. We get rid of it in 1933. So we hang on to it for a while. We do. And if you're wondering why do they care more about poor guys in the city than the country, because you can see them. I'm from the Ozarks. I know where the poor guys are in the country. My family, some of them, they hide from you. Yeah, in the city, you have such dense population, you can see all the poor people. Yeah, in the country, yeah, they're less visible. 19th Amendment, possibly the most important amendment to the Constitution, women get to vote. So, and the president at the time period really wasn't in favor of that, but will change his mind once he sees popular opinion change. So, and that'll happen with lots of protests and people demonstrating, sometimes getting arrested for demonstrating, and then going on hunger strikes. So, it's interesting time. All right, we're so close to where we need to be because I really needed to get to the election of 1912 for our question for next time. So we're almost there. And even if we just stop here, we'd be okay. Sorry for scrolling without warning you. Yeah, we may just want to stop here with right after, yeah, the little thing there. Okay. So, and we mentioned this already, but government by expert replaces government by politician. So we really don't want our mayor deciding what sort of asphalt we use to make the streets or to decide who to contract with for garbage service. You know, they still get to vote on that and they still run cities, but the day-to-day operation of cities goes to trained professionals, city management. So government by expert replaces government by politician. This is also where you'll see the beginning of the growth of bureaucracies within governments, within cities, counties, states, and federal. leads to city managers versus mayors making day-to-day decisions, push for healthy mothers and children. So even in an era where there's really not a push for healthcare, there is a push for women and children to get healthcare. I know it really is a sexist chapter. Sorry, dudes. But the thought is, dudes should be able to take care of themselves. They go out and get jobs and pay for stuff. And the reason that moms and kids don't have it is the dudes aren't doing their jobs. It's probably those crazy immigrant Catholic dudes again that live in cities. So the push for healthy mothers and children as a foundation for a more educated and American society leads cities especially to start health clinics, to give people like Margaret Sanger jobs as health nurses who go through ethnic neighborhoods and take care of moms and kids, and also the beginning of public schools in cities to help kids learn English and American government and really help assimilate kids. So the goal of public schools during this era is assimilation and getting them ready for the workplace. So getting them to be American and obedient. And I'm not going to say, I'm not saying that they beat them. They really probably didn't, because there's a push. Although I know some of you are going to like, no, back when I was in high school, I know I taught in high school when we could paddle people. It's like, yeah, I'm not doing that. But in this era, part of the reason they're pushing for women to become teachers is because they're less likely to hit the kids. And if you read stuff written during this era, that's kind of what they say. They don't say like women are smarter or anything like that. They go like they're more nurturing and less likely to hit the kids. I don't know, but it was a theory during that time period. And the idea of Americanizing immigrants, people's workplaces sometimes required them to take Americanization classes. Henry Ford really pushed that. There's some weird videos on YouTube you can find about that. They're essentially newsreels. They look like little commercials where you go in wearing the customary dress, you go into some tent and you walk in wearing the customary dress of your country and you look all downtrodden and sad, and you come out waving an American flag and dressed like Uncle Sam or something. It's weird. Okay, we'll just go with that. But it's also really common for the time period. And I think stuff like that, if you look at newspapers and newsreels and stuff from the time period, and it's also why I think reading a book that would seem racist isn't necessarily bad, because it shows you what's true of the time period. Now, if somebody comes out with a really racist book now, that's different. But when you look at historical stuff and they have terms that you would look at and go like, that's racist, it is now, and it may or may not have been then. So it kind of educates you in a different way and offends you at the same time. All right. And we're also going to start regulating and licensing professions like law, medicine, engineering, social work, and teaching, which means people are going to start going to college to get jobs. Not a lot of people, it's still not the trend, but people are going to start going to college. Also, it will vary from state to state how hard the bar exam is, the medical boards, the engineering test, teaching certification, all that stuff. But creating and licensing these professions also creates a middle class. So a professional class that isn't going to get wealthy, but is going to have a nice living, except for, I don't want to argue about the teacher thing, but compared to, and I have a different perspective about this, I think, because of where I grew up, because my dad's not going to watch this, I will freely tell you, my dad will be 80 on his next birthday, and he still works. Now, some of you are going like, that's cool. An 80-year-old guy still has the energy to work. That part is cool. Here's the part that's not cool. He needs the money. That's the part that's not cool. So when you enter a profession like those that are regulated, your assumption is you won't have to work till you're 80 and you'll have some savings, that sort of thing. That's also a clue to you that Social Security may not cover all your bills, just a thought. But these professions are going to create a different class of people who usually run institutions that most of us participate in, like schools and hospitals and courts and legislatures and things like that. And you'll want an engineer to design your roads and bridges and things like that. That's super important. It is. But creating this new class also creates this group of people that are pretty sure that they should be in charge of stuff like reform. And sometimes those people, even though they're super well-meaning, are irritating to the people they're trying to reform. And you'll notice that in this time period too, which is kind of weird. Kind of weird. All right, you can stop looking at my notes. Now you can look at my face. Okay, so I feel like I'm probably done, and you're going like, thank goodness, and it's not that early anyway. But let me kind of check the roll as we end and see if you have any questions, anything you guys want to ask. And I think probably still somebody with your question about the Irish, I think sometimes people still did harass the Irish because they were Catholic. And you'll also notice this is the era where you start to see private church schools, specifically Catholic schools, develop in large, especially northeastern cities. And I know, New Orleans, yes. Okay, let me see who I didn't notice being here on roll check number 1. Alex, Harmon, are you here? Oh, I'll stop recording too, because who needs to hear that?